we've all heard it, right? That attractive people have it easier, like doors just open for them and people are quicker to smile at them. But have you ever wondered how feeling attractive might change how you act yourself?
Mm.
Not just how people treat you, but how you kind of navigate the world and how you treat other people.
That's such an interesting place to start.
Mm.
And it really gets at the heart of what we're looking at today.
Yeah.
You sent over some research about this, and it's so fascinating, looking at that connection between how attractive you think you are and how likely you are to be kind of, well, selfish, I guess.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, does looking good actually make you a good person? Or could it lead to like a different kind of focus on yourself?
Exactly. So the research that we're diving into today is by Fei Teng and their team, and it was published in Evolution in Human Behavior.
Okay.
And what really got me was the main question they were going after. Does how attractive you see yourself actually change how likely you are to put your own needs first? And if it does, like, what's the story there? Because it turns out there are some pretty different ideas about what might be going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's impressive to get a really well-rounded view of this. They actually did 5 separate studies, which is a lot for one paper,
Wow.
with over 1,300 people in total from the U.S. and China. So,
wow.
They used all sorts of methods. They asked people about their intentions. They had them do actual behavioral tasks. And they even had some really clever ways to see what happens when people kind of feel more or less attractive at different times.
Yeah.
So it's like a really multifaceted approach.
It really digs deep. Okay, so the study starts off by looking at two pretty opposite ideas about this whole thing.
Okay.
On the one hand, you've got this idea from social psychology called the what is beautiful is good stereotype.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that? What's the basic idea there?
Yeah, so this idea is really fascinating.
Yeah.
It's like we automatically link positive qualities with attractive people. Like if someone's attractive, we assume they're also smarter, they're friendlier, they're just better at stuff, across the board.
Like a halo effect, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the thinking goes, because attractive people are often treated so well, they might actually start acting in ways that fit those expectations. So maybe they end up being more selfless because people expect them to be.
So they rise to meet those expectations, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
But then the researchers bring in a whole other perspective from evolutionary psychology.
Yeah.
And that says that being attractive might actually lead things in a very different direction, right?
It does. If you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, attractiveness signals things like health and being able to have kids.
Right, yeah.
Researchers like Lukaszewski and Sugiyama have said that this inherent advantage might make people feel more entitled. Like they deserve more simply because they're seen as desirable. This kind of gives them more power in social situations, so maybe they start putting their own needs and wants above other people's.
So you've got these two competing ideas. Beauty making you good because of how society treats you, versus beauty leading to this feeling of entitlement that can make you act in your own self-interest. So before we see how this study tackles that, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what self-interested behavior actually means.
Okay.
I mean, it's more than just looking out for number one, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So the researchers defined it as actions that are mostly focused on getting benefits for yourself. These could be tangible things like more money or resources, or intangible things like a better reputation. But the important part is that these actions can sometimes hurt other people. So it's not just about you getting ahead, it's about potentially getting ahead at someone else's expense.
Right, so there's a kind of trade-off there. That's the key thing.
Exactly. And economics usually focuses on financial self-interest, but this study looks at it from a broader, more psychological view.
Yeah, okay.
They point out that some things can make self-interested behavior more likely. Like, for instance, when money is involved, when someone has a lot of power, or even when they feel anonymous. It's like setting the scene for what they're really looking at.
Right, so it sets up the context. Okay, so they've got these two different theories and a clear idea of what they're after. Now, this idea of psychological entitlement keeps coming up. So what exactly does that mean? And how does it fit into this whole puzzle?
Psychological entitlement is basically a deep down feeling that you deserve special treatment. You should get more than your fair share, and you should get preferential treatment just because you're you. It's like someone who thinks they deserve the best table at a restaurant, or they can cut in line because they're just, that much more important.
Right.
And a lot of research has already shown a connection between this feeling of entitlement and selfish behavior. So people who feel more entitled tend to act in ways that benefit themselves, even if it means breaking the rules or taking advantage of others.
That makes sense. So the study is looking at whether feeling attractive might lead to this feeling of entitlement.
Right.
And then whether that feeling of entitlement is what actually makes people act more in their own self-interest.
Exactly. That's a big part of their hypothesis. Yeah. They're basically saying that the advantages that come with being attractive might lead to this stronger sense of psychological entitlement, and that feeling is the link between attractiveness and those selfish actions.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's jump into that first study.
Okay.
It was an online survey with folks in the U.S.
Right.
What were they measuring, and what were some of those initial findings?
So in study 1, they used a questionnaire online to figure out how attractive people thought they were. They also measured how entitled they felt and how likely they said they would be to act selfishly in different scenarios.
Okay, and what did they find? What's the first piece of the puzzle?
The results showed a really clear pattern.
Uh-huh.
People who rated themselves as more attractive also said they felt more entitled and were more likely to want to act in ways that would only benefit them.
Interesting.
But here's where it gets really cool.
Okay.
They use this statistical method called mediation analysis. It's like figuring out how a chain reaction works.
Okay.
We see these two things linked, feeling attractive and wanting more for yourself, and mediation analysis lets us see if there's something in between that explains that link.
Like a stepping stone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in this case, it looked like that stepping stone was the feeling of entitlement. That seemed to explain why people who felt more attractive also intended to act more selfishly.
So that's a strong start. But of course, what people say they'll do and what they actually do are sometimes two different things. So what did they do in the second study to look at real behavior?
Exactly, yeah. So study 2 is all about seeing if those same connections held up when they look at actions, not just intentions.
Okay.
This time, they had students in China do this activity called a resource allocation game. It's basically about deciding how to split raffle tickets and a bit of money between yourself and someone else. But you wouldn't interact with that other person again, so it's a good way to see how much people prioritize their own gain over being fair.
A real-world test of selfishness, huh?
Totally.
So did they see a similar pattern in this different cultural setting?
They did. Just like in the first study with those U.S. participants, the Chinese students who saw themselves as more attractive took more of the raffle tickets and money for themselves. So they were being more selfish. And again, that link between self-perceived attractiveness and selfish behavior was explained by how entitled they felt.
So it's consistent across cultures. That's really interesting.
Exactly. It makes it a lot stronger finding.
Yeah, feeling attractive seems to be linked to taking more for yourself. And that feeling of deserving more, that entitlement, seems to be what's driving it. But these first two studies are really just showing a correlation, right? How did the researchers try to prove a cause and effect relationship?
Right, so that's what they did in study 3.
Okay.
They wanted to see if they could actually change how likely people were to act selfishly by directly changing how entitled they felt.
Okay.
And they wanted to see how that might interact with how attractive people already felt.
Yeah.
They had U.S. participants do a writing task that was either designed to make them feel more entitled or to serve as a neutral comparison.
Okay, so what kind of things did they have them write about to try and shift that feeling of entitlement?
Okay, so in the group where they were trying to boost entitlement, they asked people to write about why they deserve good things in life, why they should reach their career goals, and why they deserve to be treated with respect. The other group, the control group, wrote about more mundane, everyday stuff. Then, after the writing, they measured how likely people were to act in their own self-interest.
So what happened? Did making people feel more deserving actually change how they said they would act?
Yeah, it did. They found that boosting people's sense of psychological entitlement made them more likely to say they would act in selfish ways.
Okay.
But here's a really interesting twist.
Okay.
This increase in selfish intentions, because of feeling more entitled, was actually stronger in the people who said they weren't that attractive to begin with.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. So it's not just that attractive people get more self-focused when they feel entitled.
Right.
It's almost like feeling entitled kind of gives permission to people who don't see themselves as attractive to also act more selfishly.
Exactly. It suggests that while feeling attractive might naturally lead to entitlement and then selfishness, even people who don't think they're that attractive can be pushed towards those selfish intentions if you make them feel more entitled. It really highlights how powerful that sense of deservingness is.
Yeah, so they've messed with entitlement and seen a result. What about directly manipulating how attractive people feel? That's what they did in study 4, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
In that study, they tried to make people feel more physically attractive, but only temporarily. They had some participants remember and write in detail about a specific time when they felt really attractive, while the control group wrote about something ordinary, like a trip to the grocery store.
Okay.
It's a technique that Bellamy and Neal used in earlier research to temporarily change how attractive people felt.
It's a pretty clever approach.
Yeah.
And did this temporary boost in attractiveness actually change their intentions and their sense of entitlement?
It did. Those who thought about a time they felt really attractive reported stronger intentions to act selfishly.
Mm.
And importantly, they also said they felt more psychologically entitled compared to the group who wrote about the grocery store. And again, they found that this increased feeling of entitlement was what explained why feeling more attractive led to those more selfish intentions. So it's even more evidence for a direct cause and effect link.
So even a short-lived feeling of being more attractive can make you want more for yourself.
Mm.
And it's that feeling of entitlement that's really behind it all.
Right.
This is really pointing toward that evolutionary perspective. But the study had one more layer, right? Looking at whether being watched changes things.
Right.
Tell us about study 5.
Study 5 was all about seeing if the social situation mattered, specifically whether you think people are watching you or not, and how that might influence the connection between feeling attractive and acting selfishly. They also changed up how they influenced people's perceptions of their own attractiveness.
Okay.
This time, they showed some people a bunch of photos that had been rated as unattractive. The idea was that this social comparison would make them feel relatively more attractive.
That's another smart way to do it.
Yeah.
So how did they actually measure that selfish behavior in this study?
They used the dictator game again. That's where one person gets to decide how to split points with another person who has no say in it.
Mm-hmm.
But this time, they changed whether that dictator's decision was private or if everyone else knew what they decided.
Okay, so they're feeling more attractive after seeing those less attractive faces, and now they're playing this game where they can be generous or selfish, either secretly or in front of everyone. What were the main findings in this last study?
The results were really interesting.
Okay.
So first, when people thought their decisions were private, they found the same thing as before.
Mm.
The ones who felt more attractive after seeing those less attractive photos were more selfish in the dictator game.
Okay.
They kept more points for themselves, and like we've seen, this was again linked to their increased sense of entitlement.
But what about when their decisions were public? Did that change anything?
This is the really interesting part. When people knew everyone would see their choices, that effect of feeling more attractive on selfish behavior completely vanished. There was no real difference in how selfishly people acted, whether they'd seen those less attractive photos or not.
So it's like when people know they're being watched, that connection between feeling attractive and being selfish just disappears?
Exactly.
What's the thinking behind that?
The researchers think it comes down to wanting to look good to others. Being seen as generous and fair is a good thing socially, and people want others to think well of them.
Yeah.
Having a good reputation can help you in a lot of ways.
Right.
So even if someone feels like they deserve to take more, they might hold back on those selfish urges when they know everyone's watching, so they seem more like a team player.
That makes a lot of sense. So basically, that possible evolutionary pull to be selfish when you're feeling attractive can be overridden by that social desire to be seen as good.
Exactly. So putting it all together, these 5 studies are saying that feeling attractive does predict selfish behavior, both in what people say they'll do and what they actually do. And this seems to be largely driven by an increased sense of psychological entitlement. The evidence seems to favor that evolutionary perspective over the simple, what is beautiful is good idea.
Right, right.
But that last study's finding is really crucial. It's saying that this link isn't set in stone. When people are watching, those worries about reputation seem to curb those selfish tendencies, even in those who feel more attractive and entitled.
So what does this all mean for us? Why should we care about these findings?
Well, think about it. Selfish behavior can hurt cooperation in all sorts of places, like in our personal relationships, at work, and in society as a whole.
Absolutely.
Knowing that even short-term changes in how attractive someone feels can make them more likely to be selfish is really important. It suggests that we should be aware of how perceptions of attractiveness, both our own and others, could be subtly affecting how we interact with each other. Maybe if we understand that feeling of entitlement that can come with feeling attractive, we can find ways to encourage people to be more cooperative.
That's a good point. And like any good research, the authors pointed out some limitations and suggested areas for future research. What were some of those?
One of the big things they mentioned was that they focused on self-perceived attractiveness.
Yeah.
How attractive you think you are is definitely important, but it would be really interesting to see what happens when you use more objective measures of attractiveness in future studies.
Yeah.
Like how other people rate someone's looks and how that affects behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they also acknowledge that their methods for making people feel more entitled and attractive, while they're commonly used, could have had some unintentional cues that might have influenced how people responded.
Hmm.
It would be interesting to see if more subtle ways of doing this in future research could give us even more solid evidence.
Hmm.
And lastly, they talked about the idea that the what is beautiful is good stereotype might be more of a surface level thing, like how we quickly judge people when we first meet them, while that evolutionary perspective might be a deeper, more fundamental explanation for why people actually behave the way they do.
So for me, the really surprising takeaway, and hopefully for you listening too, is that it's not just about attractive people getting treated better. It's that simply feeling more attractive can actually make you more likely to act in your own self-interest, especially when you think nobody's watching.
Right.
It's like looking in the mirror can actually have a direct, almost unconscious effect on the choices we make.
Absolutely. You were curious about whether looking good meant being good, and this research shows that it's a much more complicated and maybe less idealistic relationship than that.
So here's something to think about. Given these findings, how might those biases we all have towards attractive people, even if we're not aware of them, actually be encouraging this kind of selfish behavior?
Yeah.
It's something to consider in your own life, in how you interact with people, and just in the world around you.
That's a really thought-provoking question. It makes you think about the bigger societal impact of something that often feels very personal.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us into this really interesting research. I always learn so much from your insights.
It's always a pleasure to explore these things together.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. We hope this has given you a new way to think about the connection between attractiveness and how people act. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this or any questions you might have. Maybe it will even inspire our next deep dive.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep thinking deeply.
And critically. Take care.